A lot of history, a lot of past experiences went into shaping the Constitution that was drafted in 1787. Just as influential, if not more so, were the principles that shaped the new government. The belief that rights are endowed by God, the belief that because individual rights come from our Creator, they are inherent and inalienable, which means that government is and must be limited. If rights come from God, then no man, no government of men has the authority to infringe upon them. Rather, as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, government's purpose is to secure these rights. In the same manner, another principle is the understanding that God is the ultimate source of authority. No human being is above God's law. God did not delegate all of his authority to any individual or body of men. Rather, God delegated limited authority to individuals and specific institutions, such as family, church, and civil government. The founders expressed that the authority any government has comes from the consent of the governed, often expressed in textbooks as popular sovereignty. This should naturally lead to this question: what authority does the governed have? Who are the governed? Just a collection of individuals, right? So, what authority does a collection of individuals have? Does an individual suddenly acquire more authority when choosing to do something with other people? If an individual may not steal, does that change if that individual is with 2 or more people? Of course not. So, what authority does one person have? Answer: an individual has the authority to exercise any action that does not prevent another individual from exercising authority in the same way. Meaning, people may not, cannot delegate to government. They may not, cannot consent or concede to government the authority to do anything they themselves may not do. After all, you can't give what you don't have. The inherent sinfulness of man is a third principle the Constitution is based upon. As James Madison said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. You could also say, if men were angels, government would not have to be limited. But because of the inherent sinful nature of man, those who acquire authority and power tend to reach for more. Over time, an increasing amount of authority and power is centralized, concentrated into the hands of governing officials at the expense of individual liberty and the institutional sovereignty of other areas of life, such as family, church, schools, universities, business, labor, and local communities. Similarly, a fourth principle the U.S. Constitution is based upon is the nature of government. George Washington said it best: government is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. Civil government has a monopoly on force. It is the only body authorized to use violence and the threat of violence on others. However, because of the first 2 principles we addressed, God as the source of rights and authority, just because civil government has a monopoly on the use of force does not mean it may use force anytime and for anything it wants. Its use of force must be within its legitimate authority. Now, the legitimate authority of government is outside the scope of this video. However, I will provide links in the description to videos that do address such issues. Now, equating government to fire is useful. Fire, when contained, when limited to its proper use, is beneficial. Fire, after all, cooks our food, heats our water, warms our homes, and starts our cars, for instance. However, when fire gets beyond its containment, outside its proper place, it becomes incredibly destructive and dangerous. It hurts, burns, damages, destroys, wreaks havoc and fear, ruins livelihoods, and kills. Like fire, government, when contained to its proper role, when limited to particular and specific functions, when prevented from spreading beyond its legitimate bounds, is also beneficial. It helps establish an environment of peace and stability. It creates an atmosphere allowing individuals to pursue their happiness. It promotes and protects the incentives for people to create, innovate, develop, invest, and come together for common purposes that result in better, more meaningful lives than would be possible under a situation where government gets outside its containment. So how did the Founding Fathers apply the aforementioned principles to the development of an American system of government, to the creation of the Constitution? First, the purpose of a Constitution and the decision to have a written Constitution is based upon the understanding that the nature of man is sinful and the nature of government is force. Unlike Britain, Americans decided to have a written Constitution. Now, a Constitution does not have to be written. Britain's wasn't, but America's is. Why? The conflict between the British North American colonies and Britain was largely a constitutional conflict. Because the British Constitution was not a written document, but based on tradition, and maybe some written documents here and there, but no document was the Constitution. As a result, when Americans would argue that British actions in the 1760s and 1770s were unconstitutional, the British would simply disagree with their own constitutional interpretations. These British interpretations were incredibly flexible and inconsistent with what Americans saw as established precedent and tradition. Interpreting the Constitution so broadly and loosely was a clear threat to the liberty of the American colonists. They learned that an unwritten Constitution was like trying to pin jelly to the wall. Thus, in America, the Constitution would be written. Now, the only reason to have a Constitution in the first place is to limit government power. To make that more likely, they discovered that it must be written. A written Constitution makes it much more difficult for agents of the government to exercise power in a capricious way. A written Constitution makes arbitrary rule and the concentration of power into the hands of the government much more difficult. For Americans, an unwritten Constitution was too flexible, too indeterminate, too hard to nail down to serve as a safeguard of their liberties, so they wanted to write it down. Having a written Constitution is based upon the understanding that the nature of man is sinful and the nature of government is force. The main purpose for having a written Constitution is to protect the people of the states from this new federal government the states created. As Thomas Jefferson said, the Constitution is to serve as chains on the federal government. Or, if we allude to Washington's fire analogy, the Constitution is the fireplace meant to contain the government. The design of the Constitution also accounts for the sin nature of man and the forceful nature of government. For instance, the Constitution creates a decentralized system. The powers of the American system of government are divided both horizontally and vertically. Horizontally, the Constitution establishes basically three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. All are tasked with defending the Constitution, but each have separate roles, separate powers, and separate responsibilities. This separation, this decision to decentralize the main aspects of government, helps to prevent a concentration of power and abuse of authority by any one branch. Not only are there three branches created for this purpose, but one branch, the legislative branch, arguably the most powerful of the three, is itself divided into two parts to separate its influential and significant role even further. Now, before we move on to another example of how the principles we addressed help shape the design of the Constitution, I want to go on a short tangent. Unlike what you've probably been taught and what you often hear from politicians and political commentators both on TV and radio, the separate branches of government were not created, were not designed to be equal. One often hears the phrase, separate but co-equal branches of government. Separate, yes. Equal in their duty to abide by the Constitution, yes. But not equal in authority. A cursory look at the Constitution will reveal that the legislative branch has many more powers than the other two. This is seen not only in the enumeration of powers, but in the length of each article of the Constitution dealing with these branches. Article 1 is clearly the longest and is ascribed more powers. Creating a list of powers for each branch, one discovers that the legislative branch far outweighs the other two. Some of the most significant powers belong to Congress, not the executive or the courts, such as the power to declare war and the power of the purse. Congress can literally stop the president from doing anything by simply denying him funding. Granted, the other two have ways of checking the legislative branch, as does the legislative branch of checking them, but in terms of enumerated powers, the legislative branch wins hands down. Not only is there horizontal separation of powers, but vertical as well. The Constitution recognizes a federal system of government, which is linked to the understanding that human activity ought to be governed at the lowest level possible. There are three basic levels of civil government: local, state, and federal. Those things that can be done locally remain at that level. Those things that cannot be done locally are addressed by the particular state. The federal government's role basically addresses those areas that states, by themselves, would either struggle with, or those areas that threaten the amicable relationship states have with each other. More specifically, the federal government's jurisdiction can be found in Article 1, Section 8, where most of their powers are enumerated. The federal government is limited to what is on that list. Thus, in addition to there being horizontal and vertical separation of powers to deal with the natures of man and government, the framers included the enumeration of expressly delegated powers in Article 1, Section 8 to do so as well. It is a can-do list. It is much easier to limit government with a can-do list than a cannot-do list. Explicitly listing the authority Congress has helps prevent it from abusing its authority by doing more than intended. Thus, Article 1, Section 8 serves to limit the federal government and prevent it from encroaching on the sovereignty of the states and infringing on the rights of the people within those states. The 10th Amendment reinforces this concept. More nuanced than this federal system of government is the fact that Americans at the time, as well as the framers and the state legislatures, recognized the jurisdiction of other institutions that exist separate from civil government, such as families, voluntary organizations, towns, states, universities, the church, and more. Each of these social authorities has powers and rights of its own that the central government cannot overturn. Each of these institutions, each of these spheres, have their own responsibilities, their own particular roles outside the authority of the civil government. Each, it was known, is a potential source of resistance to the central government. Each serve as a barrier to the concentration and centralization of power and authority into the hands of a few, thereby helping to protect state sovereignty and individual liberty.